Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. It's an honor to have Samantha here, and she's going to be talking about how internet shapes or affects our thoughts and actions at both at an individual level and at a social and political level. So I'm really excited about it. The format is going to be, she's going to make a presentation first, then maybe I will ask a couple of clarificatory questions, and then we're going to go into the breakout rooms to discuss these ideas which have been put on the table amongst ourselves. And then we come back. And when we come back with your best questions. We're going to organize all the questions, and then all of us and Samantha will answer those questions. So we're going to really get into this topic. I want to do it in a slightly more long form way so that people can express themselves more. Still try to be concise, but you don't have to be brief. As long as you're doing, like, if you're filling every second with good stuff, you're fine. So let's see how that period works. But first, Samantha, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. It's so wonderful to see you. I'm going to share my screen here while we discuss how the internet molds political thought and action. So I am specifically looking at politics here. Let's see if I can adjust where your videos pop up, because it's in my way.
Samantha, you don't have to worry about that, because what they're the people will actually select their own, the way in which it appears to them. They are able to select, they are able to move things. Folks, in the
I can't see my mouse, and I would like to make it appear on my screen a bit differently, since it's covering some of my words. Well, let's begin and see how I do. Okay, so today I'm going to start by sharing you a thesis. This is a work in progress, so all of your insights and ideas are very welcome. I do have a thesis statement, which is going to let you know some of my intentions for some of these observations I've been having. We'll be talking a bit about the philosophy of orientation. If you're not familiar, it's a fairly new philosophy on the scene in the continental tradition. We'll discuss that a little more. The medium is the message. So I'm going to be bringing Marshall McLuhan into this conversation. It's wonderful that this group 52 Living Ideas has discussed Marshall McLuhan in the past. So speaking to experts, I'm sure. We'll be talking about the sensibilities of these technologies, both mass media and the digital era, talking about political discourse in particular, sort of the content of these technologies, and a little bit about disruptive politics and its contrary, a constructive political agenda. I'll explain all of this a little more as we get to it, but let's begin with this thesis. So the digitization of our world and online political discourse in particular strengthens trends of social atomization. They focus on systemic issues, an enhanced mood of unsettlement among individuals, and increased pressure or incentives for individuals and public entities to adopt a public standpoint. And it's these trends which make for a transformed and online public to be more likely to engage in specifically disruptive styles of political engagement. So just briefly, when I say social atomization, I'm talking about an increased sense of individualism. I'm talking also about trends of more social isolation that we see in this online world. When I talk about disruptive styles of political engagement, I'm specifically focusing on civil disorder, direct action that's typically aimed at shutting down or hindering government apparatus and business as usual, these kinds of activism. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of orientation. Here's a picture of Werner Stegmeier. He is the creator of the philosophy of orientation. He is a student of Heidegger. So he is in that tradition of continental philosophy. Now it's And what's important to understand about the philosophy of orientation, it's a philosophy of everyday living. So we're not talking about metaphysical ideas. We're not making claims about how the world works or how society works. And we're not making ethical claims about how things should operate. The philosophy of orientation is aimed at creating philosophical observations about specifically how we find our way. So orientation, we can define as the achievement of finding one's way in a new situation. And this always happens under time pressure and uncertainty. In every new situation, and nearly all situations are new somewhat, we have some sense of time pressure, and perhaps our own mortality is the ultimate time pressure. And uncertainty. We never know exactly what another person is thinking. We never know exactly all of the variables that might be at work in our environment. So these are important notions. We're aiming to gain mastery over our current situation. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this philosophy is that it has a primary distinction of unsettlement, really a feeling of unsettlement, versus reassuring calmness. And this is a primary distinction as opposed to truth or false or right and wrong. So this philosophy, again, isn't talking about metaphysics. It's not talking about epistemological claims of what we can know and what we can't. It's just talking about how do we find our way. And in the experience of finding our way, we often move from a feeling of unsettlement to reassuring calmness. Whether or not we found a way that's somehow related to an objective truth, this is agnostic about. It is an embodied philosophy focusing on these feelings as an observation of how humans actually do direct their actions. And so political orientation in this model is how do we make or judge binding decisions for the whole of society? We'll discuss a little bit more of that later. So philosophy of orientation, moving on. So how do we speak about finding our way? Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of these phenomenological terms, easy though they are, it's important to note that orientation can precede thought in action. In fact, it's inexorable. We are always somewhat oriented. We can see that when we're born and even before we're born, while we're still developing, that we are, you can say, oriented towards the satisfaction of our biological needs. So it can be pre-conscious in this area. As biological animal beings, we are oriented towards our own survival at the very least. But especially as human beings, orientation gains this level of consciousness and intellect. So how does that work? We're going to be discussing phenomenology, and in particular, a phenomenology of language of orientation. This is, in particular, how do we speak about finding our way, and how does that way of speaking relate to the mental processes that are in motion during these new situations that we're trying to master? So this is just one tool among others in the philosophy of orientation. Brain research is relevant here in terms of how we orient ourselves. Sociological research is relevant here. But focusing on phenomenology for the moment, we're starting with a mood. So your orientation, as you can see on the bottom here, only becomes noticeable when it no longer works. So when you're in this mood of unsettlement, you're naturally galvanized to try to figure out this situation, to understand something you don't understand. I'm using this picture here. I'm not sure if anyone can recognize this particular politician, the governor of, I'm not sure. I had this in my head earlier, I forget. But he's with his young son here at a voting booth on election day. And let's just say that you're a young child accompanying your father to a voting booth for the first time. You might not understand what's going on. So your attention is drawn to these various stimuli that you're seeing. You're seeing the voting booths, you're seeing lots of people waiting in long lines, perhaps you're seeing long printed out ballots. In order to understand a situation like this that is new, we often detach from this situation first. And we pin down footholds, which is to say certain footholds might be linguistic terms. These are often called signs in the philosophy of orientation. We're going to mark the term voting booth with this site that we have of these voting booths lined up like that. There are signs, other visual signs, these long lines and these ballot forms as well. And there are maybe audio signs of people discussing election matters. All of these are brought into our minds in a kind of a pattern, a network of points of reference that constitute an overview of this new situation that you're trying to grasp. Rules might be in this situation, sort of rules of social conduct that help inform how you're interacting in this new situation. You're retaining all of this knowledge finally to use it for the future. You're eventually going to sit in the classroom one day, perhaps, and discuss democracy and what that means. And you can refer to this experience you had with your father on election day in order to gain some sense of mastery over, again, a new situation and new subject matter in the classroom. Let's make sure. It's also important to say that in orientation, we say the strongest footholds are our routines. And a routine might be something as simple as the fact that we've used our eyes before to observe things. We've asked our father questions when we didn't understand something. We've made inferences based on the clues that we see in our surroundings. So this is all sort of very basic and maybe instinctual, but it's sort of important within the philosophy of orientation to try to lay all of this meaning out and discern the nuances of how this actually functions in our minds when we're finding our way. So the philosophy of orientation, we're finding our way, traveling through a landscape of the political imagination today. So we can use this metaphor of a map or navigational language. What's interesting is that orientation did originate as a purely navigational term. It was Mendelssohn, followed by Immanuel Kant, who used it in a philosophical way for the first time. And since then, a metaphorical use of orientation and how you're oriented has just exploded. But Stegmeier would argue that very few people have tried to define the meaning of orientation in this explicitly philosophical way. So that's what we're here for. One interesting aspect of this theory is the fact that orientation is perspectival. We often discuss how we have a standpoint. It might be a political standpoint, certainly a biological standpoint, my standpoint in this environment, what I'm able to ascertain. We have many standpoints all coexisting simultaneously, and this standpoint often is the basis from which our perspective is generated. It is an individual perspective. It's important to note that there's always someone orienting himself or herself. And our perspective is on a horizon, again, another orientation type metaphor of maybe what we understand, maybe a kind of availability heuristic, what was last referred to is what we're drawing upon to understand a particular new situation from our current standpoint. And I have this quote here that I really like. The philosophy of orientation is the positive response to the dreaded nihilism and relativism. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just read this quick quote from the Fearless Findings that I sent a link to in the description of this group. It is the assumption that there is ultimately nothing firm in our orientation is often in philosophy considered as nihilism, that all cognition and action is bound to standpoints, horizons, and perspectives as relativism. Most contemporary philosophers are afraid of both. The philosophy of orientation takes away the fear by reevaluating them. This is supported by the mere concept of orientation, which in our times is used positively everywhere. Our orientation succeeds under the conditions of so-called nihilism and relativism. So this at least claims that there might be an objective truth, but that's an ideal. No one can claim to know that. And yet people manage to find their way through life. They manage to commit themselves to causes and make claims and support those claims. And this is all happening under this context of rather extreme uncertainty from an epistemological standpoint. All right. So let's talk about social interaction. It's very important when we talk about politics online. So I have drawn out these quotes, which hopefully I can read them with some of them obscured. First, other people are the most trustworthy and reliable foothold in orientation, but they can also become the most surprising experience. So almost every time we're talking with someone and we realize that, of course, they have a different orientation that we do. They have a different way of acting or behaving or thinking. This can be very unsettling. It can arise in us an awareness of the risks of our own orientation. Maybe they know something that I don't know and I should. Maybe something they're doing is something I should be doing for my own health and well-being. Maybe they're sounding more intelligent than I sound and I should read similar books. So we're aware of our risks when we interact with other people. It's also a perception of opportunities on the more positive side. Next, everyone unintentionally, immediately, and almost noticeably changes his or her behavior when realizing that others are present. This is very interesting in the context of online. People are present in a virtual sense. So it's very interesting to at least ask the question, does this virtual presence of other people, is it changing how I act online and to what extent? Certainly when I'm putting forth a message on social media or broadcast or something, how is that affected by this feeling that other people are watching, reflecting on my orientation, reacting to it, and probably judging it? This often brings up questions of our own identity, for instance. Now, communication doesn't equal a consensus or a method of reassuring calmness necessarily. Oftentimes, communicating doesn't solve or end orientation problems. It just creates new and complex orientation problems under more conditions. So that's an important thing to consider when we're thinking about online communication and communication in any sphere. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Marshall McLuhan. So the medium is the message. This is based on his idea that technology is an extension of the human body. So in this picture, we have a camera. We can say that the camera is an enhancement and an extension of the human eye and the faculty of sight. A bicycle might be an enhancement of the human legs. Computer might be an enhancement of the human brain. Now, every time we're engaging with one of these technologies, it's disturbing the perceptual ratio of the senses. Now, what does that mean? In the context of this camera example, perhaps we are very intensely focused on the image that we are seeing through the lens. We are focusing that image. Our attention is very heightened in this particular direction. And maybe we don't have such a great sense of our oral environment and the sounds, maybe cars passing. We're not even noticing this. Our sight is enhanced and it's obsolescing, you could say, other senses that we might have, our sense of touch, other senses. Now, we say that medium or technologies are environments. They create these environments in which we're operating in this disturbed perceptual ratio. As an environment, we can make the distinction between the ground versus a figure. So the figure might be that object that we are concentrating on in our lens. It is the object of our conscious attention. The ground is this environment. The ground can be the technology itself and how it's affecting these ratio of the senses. The ground might be a kind of environment, metaphorically speaking, of the history of photography that maybe we're drawing upon when we're taking this picture. It certainly is the environment surrounding us. It's oftentimes just below the level of consciousness, but it is affecting us in a deep way, whether or not we recognize it. And McLuhan has a great quote: "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." So soon we'll be talking about how the tool of online technology in the digital era is shaping us. So I'm trying to bring these two philosophies together. And there is some tension that you could say, although philosophy of orientation does try to be a unity of many philosophies and different observation methods of observation, tries to satisfy everyone, at least with this focus on moods, objects of attention, and these consciousness, what's happening in consciousness. You could say that, according to McLuhan, it's focusing on the figure, the object of our conscious attention, the lady in the foreground, and not, say, the Capitol building in the background, which is very likely affecting her in a way that we're not currently focused on in this photo. Versus McLuhan is focusing a lot on these aspects, environmental aspects that distort our consciousness, maybe imperceptibly. But what brings these two schools of thought together is really, I think, their focus on sense experience. They're very deeply rooted in the body. This is not taking on the same kind of dualism of mind and body, and saying mind over matter and looking for pure reason. This is an embodied philosophy, both of these really. And we're finding our way in a holistic way that incorporates our whole experience. So let's see. Yeah, so as we continue, we're going to look at some of the sensibilities of different technologies. And what I mean by that is some of these ground rules, when we talk about the ground which is formed by different technological innovations. We might discuss in the breakout rooms which senses are enhanced by the technology, which are obsolesced, which are retrieved, what experiences are retrieved, and which sense experiences, when emphasized to an incredible degree, are actually flipped. This is McLuhan's tetrad, which this group has discussed on a number of occasions and in previous groups. So this is also applicable here. Let's try to use this. So first, you see here I'm talking about mass media sensibility. So why even discuss mass media at all? Because after all, the factors in this and the next two slides, these were present here in the era of print and in the era of TV. And I think we should discuss them here because the digital era has retrieved aspects from these former technological eras and has intensified them. So depersonalized communication. What is this and how does this figure, how does this photo metaphorically represent it? When we are interacting online, oftentimes we are projecting our own standpoint in a public way towards an amorphous, often anonymous audience. It's not like face-to-face communication in which you're discussing something with someone and their body language is affecting how you interact, and what you know of their life experiences, what you can discern about their mood. All of this is quite normal in our communication. But when we're communicating online, so many of these factors are not present anymore. And that's what I mean when I talk about depersonalized communication. So how do we find our way when online communication styles are largely depersonalized? I think that we often save face. We try to generate an unassailable online persona. To some extent, you can observe in online spaces a kind of intensification of our individuality, projecting our political standpoints, projecting our sense of style, our choice of fancy vacations, or etc. And this, I would argue, is creating this trend of social atomization. We're concentrated on our own individuality, and we're projecting that out in a largely depersonalized way on a mass audience. Next.
Samantha, let me just remind the audience. So folks, there is a lot of new material here. So what we are going to do is that please use pen and paper to keep track of all the questions, all the thoughts that you have. As soon as the presentation is over, we're going to go into questions. So go ahead and put all the questions that you have and pick the best one from that. And we'll take all the questions, we'll organize them, and we will have a discussion. All right, so please use pen and paper. Go ahead, Samantha.
All right. Moving on, let's talk more about this ground of mass media sensibility. How does it affect our senses? We have decontextualization happening. By this, I mean that when we are communicating with this mass audience, this large amorphous anonymous entity that we're hoping to reach out to, maybe seek validation from, we are focusing on issues that relate to as many people as possible. This might not be true, say, if your Facebook networks are geared specifically toward family and friends, but of course, many people nowadays are online in a very public way. They're interacting with lots of strangers on a lot of these social media platforms, Twitter, and etc. And in order to make a message readily accessible for as many people as possible, they're decontextualizing that message. They don't need to know about your personal career, your life decisions, the small town in which you live, or your hometown. They want to know about largely systemic issues that they can relate to, or any issues that they can relate to. And this creates an incentive to talk about broader issues in general. Let's talk about the national political situation rather than who my small second-tier city just voted for mayor. And next, market values. So market values, I think Jon Stewart in an interview said that the market for news media focuses on what's sensational, what's conflict-driven, and what's lazy or appeals to our preference for information we don't have to work hard to understand. It's certainly true in some senses that entities that are trying to pull one over on the public might make a press release or give out information that is so dense and so boring that real big decisions, momentous decisions that affect the communities in which they're situated aren't roused because the story itself isn't juicy enough, or it's too complex and difficult to understand. So how do we find our way when market values are determining whether our communication is received, whether our voice is heard, and whether we have access to the kind of information we need to make these good binding decisions for society at large? I would argue that we often harness market values in our own communication style when we're crafting a message to send out to our social media platforms. We want to engage people. We know maybe people respond more to pictures of my kids or pictures of cats and things like that. And this is all sort of affecting the kinds of messages that are sent and received. We are regarding ourselves as individual consumers of the information we find online, and we are judging our audience as individual consumers, often of our own message and our own projected identity. And this, again, is just another example of this trend of social atomization, enhanced individuality at the expense of maybe a community-oriented sense of being. So the digital era, now we're into online technology and what's special about it. I would argue that first, the volume and speed of information is just completely unprecedented. Marshall McLuhan has a good quote about this when, this is from 1965, so this was already starting to become a problem. I doubt, he probably could have predicted that it was going to be even as egregious as it is today, but he said that you cannot cope with vast amounts of information in the old fragmentary classified patterns. You tend to go looking for mythic and structural forms in order to manage such complex data moving at very high speeds. So I think this would support the notion that so much information, we have to make sense of it, we look for patterns, and we focus on these systemic issues, this macro vision. There's an interesting book I'd love to recommend to you by Jack Luhl. Gosh, the title will come to me, I'm sure it will. But it is about how journalists, and I think he does some content analysis from the New York Times, how they often couch their news stories in mythic archetypes. So they'll talk about a news story as a David and Goliath story, or Mother Teresa as a perfect virginal mother type character. They'll use these myths as shortcuts to help people understand and piecemeal the information they want to give to you, and make for entertaining stories. But this often, in pushing things into patterns like these, some information is lost, and it's important to recognize that. Next, interactivity is perhaps one of the most salient new features of the digital era. You can't quite interact with your TV or the print media, certainly not at the speed, instantaneous speed at which we can online. And this relates back to what we spoke about earlier in terms of social interaction being one of the most impactful and unsettling experiences that we have in terms of unsettling our sense of reassured calmness in our own orientation. The internet, unlike any other venue, exposes us to lots of opportunities for disagreement, for different points of view. It's all out there to catalyze our orientation processes. So how do we find our way when facing unprecedented levels of social interaction online? Now, first, we are experiencing, I would guess, unprecedented levels of unsettlement. The more we interact with these online spaces, and especially with topics of disagreement, the more unsettled we most likely are. So to grasp onto this feeling, to seek out this feeling that we all naturally do of reassuring calmness, we can observe, for instance, that online many people make public their standpoint or identity. Even liking a social media post or upvoting a comment online is making a standpoint public. It is committing, even if it's only temporarily, to a perspective of shared orientation with someone else who has made their standpoint public. This is related to the last trend that I want to talk about, addictive routines. So oftentimes we're talking more and more about, and it's particularly perhaps an issue with the younger generations who are using this technology, who are digital natives in a sense. And when you engage in this publicizing of your standpoint and you receive validation for that publicizing, this creates a dopamine rush. There's lots of very interesting psychological studies about how use of social media in particular activates these dopamine cycles and encourages us to spend more and more time online. Indeed, these technologies are designed to be addictive in that way, or at least to affect their users in a way that's going to be pleasurable in a very neurological, very basic sense. And we become addicted in a sense to this validation of our public personas. Okay, so let's talk about the figure. We've been talking about the ground, the overall environment. I'm sure you could think of more instances of trends that are specifically digital era online trends that I haven't mentioned. I look forward to hearing about you regarding that. But let's talk about the figure. What is in our attention, the things that we're consciously aware of. This, in the context of this conversation, is political discourse in my mind, political information, political rhetoric, and public opinion. So I just have some basic trends here to share with you. All of this has been supported by research. The top part is you can find this in other studies as well, but this Nithyanan with the URL there, if you'd like to access that. All the sources are there. There's certainly more that there's more interesting things that we can find about these topics. But it's true that traditional media content is more and more distrusted in our age. Increased use of social media as a chief news source. More people are turning to that than TV news or online news, traditional sources. There was interesting studies to support that uncivil political leaders actually have while they increase uncivil online discourse, that there's a significant and statistically significant correlation between whether or not you have a politician who is insulting and saying lewd things, and how much of that content you also see reflected online. This is also a topic of mainstreaming of the fringe political movements, fringe identitarian movements are in a sense liberated by uncivil political leaders being on the scene. And finally, public opinion. One thing that I found really interesting in the civility versus incivility research is that all disagreement, whether it's civil or uncivil, causes cognitive dissonance and negative emotions. Any disagreement is just genuinely unsettling to us. We would prefer to live in a world in which everyone shares our orientation. However, uncivil disagreement is much more likely to incite at least an intention to political action. I found that finding very interesting. And so, getting towards a summing up of what we've been talking about, the trends that were brought about by those ground rules of the technology, social atomization, focus on systemic issues or abstractions, the mythologizing of information, drawing patterns from complex information, intensified feelings of unsettlement, and an incentive to adopt a public political standpoint leads me to my point of disruptive politics. So if your mood of unsettlement is growing, if you primarily identify as an individual in contention with your government, if the locus of your political attention is on systemic issues or the macro national level, and if your trust in traditional authorities is waning, I think it is likely that more and more people will be participating in these more disruptive styles of political engagement. Here we have pictures of Arab Spring, the Tea Party, Occupy, and the January 6th uprising to overturn the last presidential election. All of these sort of are personified in some way, I would argue, by this sign you can see in the Tea Party picture, a kind of shutter down mentality. And that's not to say, I'm not trying to make an evaluative judgment of these are, I mean, I welcome anyone to make an evaluative judgment, but I only want to just observe that this kind of political engagement is becoming more and more common. More and more people are turning to it and are galvanized by this kind of engagement rather than, I mean, this also correlates with sociological research that shows less people are engaged in PTA and intramural sports, and people are often engaging on these big macro issues at the national level, and these smaller contextualized institutions are waning in their significance in our lives. Now, so that we're not technological determinists, it's important to note that there are opposing trends and there is wiggle room within all of the context that we've been talking about. Derrida's pharmakon is a useful concept here. Apparently in Greek, I'm not a specialist myself, I'm taking his word for it. Pharmakon means both poison and cure. And so in this sense, we can say that online life and online technology, digital technology, is a poison when it disrupts our society negatively, and it's a cure when it does the opposite. So two points that I will leave you with. A 2001 study found evidence for a growing movement of civic innovations. These often occurred with community organizations, environmental movements, and community health projects. So there has been, in certain areas especially, I think Hong Kong was mentioned in this research, more people who were in a small context able to meet each other online as opposed to face-to-face interactions and successfully organize small scale projects to benefit their communities. That definitely has happened, and there's research to support that. And finally, a note from McLuhan, who said that the most hopeful thing about electric age technology is that it encourages us to plunge so deeply into ourselves that we may reveal more about the inner workings of the unconscious. The more we understand about ourselves, the more we interrogate ourselves as an artifact, the more we will be able to make perhaps wiser decisions with more information. That this is a leeway or an opportunity for beneficial action based on a greater self-knowledge. Maybe the plus side of this social atomization. Okay, I have some discussion questions. If that would be helpful for you, please feel free to have your own discussions. Does the philosophy of orientation capture the conscious experience of finding our way through a complex world? How could we improve upon this model? What is it missing? Are there more characteristics of a digital era sensibility that I left out? Does our technological sensibility lead to more than just a disruptive style of engagement? I gave you some examples, I'm sure there are more. And how can we alter our technological sensibility to allow for even more of these constructive civic engagements? That's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Samantha. That was good. Can you stop sharing the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. What I think these are great questions. Let's go ahead and put them in, but let's ask people for their own questions. And we'll collect all the questions, including this one, and then we'll do a full, have everybody answer the questions. All right, let's see here. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to put your questions on the table.
Maryland, yes. I knew it was an M state.
Wonderful. All right. So we're going to start. You don't have to, if you want, you can type in the questions, or you can go ahead and just type exclamation mark
Yes.
and then state your question. So we'll start with Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Samantha. That was terrific.
Thank you so much.
I did read the paper, and I especially enjoyed the distinction of true and false as opposed to settling and unsettling. I thought that was very important and kind of reverberates through the philosophy of biology that underpins this whole thing. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the true and false as opposed to settling and unsettling, because I think that that has a lot to do with the politics that people
Wonderful.
get involved in online.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Jeff. We're going to collect all the questions and then we're going to handle them all together. So there is going to be a set of questions about the orientation philosophy. So we'll put it in that group. Okay, and then we have got, one set of questions about digital era. I think that will, and then there's a bunch of questions about, disruptive and constructive. That's the groups I have so far, but just go ahead and ask your questions and we will keep organizing them.
And I do really quick have the book that I referred to by Jack Lewell. I'll write this all out. It's
Wonderful.
called Daily News, Eternal Stories, The Mythical Role of Journalism.
Excellent. Thanks. If you could put it in the chat. Next up is going to be Jeff. Let's see, Katie, Dave, and Dave. Jeff.
Okay, but about the putting things in the chat, if you could put it in when we come back, because the chat gets erased every time we go to the breakout rooms. Well, my question was, there's so many connections here. I didn't get to read anything before to the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. I mean, we get the politics, obviously, but I'm going through her life of the mind now, and that's, I love her version of phenomenology, which you have, and then of course, her breakout work of the origins of totalitarianism is all about how atomization happens. Now, of course, she didn't have social media then, but I was just wondering. I thought we were going to have like answers from you to clarify, because I'd love to take that into the breakout rooms.
So you want to put the question, think of the question. Question is going to be, how is philosophy of Hannah Arendt connected with this?
Yeah, I guess that's the question, but I thought if there was a quick answer, I could use that to come up with a deeper question later.
Sure, thanks. So that's Jeff. Let's see, next up is Dave. Dave just wanted to ask about that. Okay, anybody else with questions? All right, then let's talk first about the philosophy of orientation. That's new to many people. Madeline, go ahead, you can put one more question.
Yeah, I did have one more question about the digital era. The way we have it now, unfortunately, Marshall McLuhan is no longer around for the interactive phase of the digital era. And I think that it offers a sameness or a foothold, as they put it, in terms of the flat screen. There's a flat screen and you only have two senses engaged, which are vision and hearing. And so there is one thing that's much more static than we're used to having in our environment, and everything else is much more dynamic. And I wonder if people think that that is one of the contributors to the flux of the online world.
Wonderful, excellent question. Static and dynamic senses that are enhanced and senses missing. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Paul, followed by Mike. Paul.
Thank you. Samantha. I am ashamed that I didn't know about Stegmeier. But when you mentioned that he was a student of Heidegger, I'm trying to put McLuhan and Heidegger together. Heidegger, basically, when you think about it, when he was talking about thrownness, and then I realized, McLuhan, that we are basically thrown, that our thrownness of our beings and our thrownness within McLuhan, which we said, thrownness in the social media. We are not individuals there. We are thrown in both in our life and in the social media. My question is that what that your theory is about?
Oh, wonderful question. Okay, we'll definitely come to that. I also want to tell you that there was an extensive correspondence, as far as I know, between Heidegger and McLuhan, and only one side of it is available. The other side is not available right now. So that's very interesting.
I'm half German and half Canadian, so and I don't know about that.
So wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Great question. Okay, we're going to get to all the questions. I'm just kind of organizing them by categories, so we'll be able to deal with them as clusters. Mike.
Yeah, I guess my question is there a different outlook for somebody in their, say, late 50s who grew up half of their life with no technology at all, and then has come to technology and uses it a great deal, as opposed to somebody now, we're probably in our second full generation of people growing up with full technology. So I'm wondering, is there a different outlook between those two different sets of people?
Wonderful. Excellent. Last chance for people to add questions. Otherwise, we have considerable number of questions about the orientation philosophy and digital era. How about we just start with the orientation philosophy? And then if you have more questions about the digital era that occur to you, go ahead. I will have one more call for questions, and then we'll go from there. So on orientation philosophy, this distinction between true and false versus comfort and discomfort, or unsettling versus calmness. What do you guys think is the implication of that? So any comments about that being the primary kind of criteria of focus? So any thoughts about that? Go ahead. If anybody wants to answer it, go ahead and type an exclamation mark, or any of your thoughts about the orientation philosophy. Go ahead and put a question, put an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom, and then we will go to Samantha. Okay, let's go with Samantha.
Yeah, I think this is such a great, stimulating question. It's interesting to note that you have competing epistemologies in the public sphere of people who just know that what they think about how the country should be run is right, and the other people are wrong, but not just wrong. Oftentimes, the people on the other side of the political boundary are trying to destroy the country. And there's definitely this emotional, you can see quite clearly this feeling of unsettlement that is a vivid background of these political ideologies. And I think perhaps maybe in our culture, we would be benefited from acknowledging how certain information that we get, certain political rhetoric that we're exposed to, is working on our emotions, and in particularly inciting fear. And that in order to develop that reassuring calmness, we're piecing together information, and we're stamping that as true rather than false, and not really acknowledging this emotional dimension that's really at work. That really we're justifying ideas according to an emotional calculus that we're not acknowledging. That's one thing I might.
Excellent. Madeline, does that answer your question, or would you like to ask a follow-up question?
Yes, in fact, I do have kind of a follow-up question.
Please.
It'll take me a minute, a couple of sentences to get to it.
Please.
Okay. One of the things I notice when I read the news, which I do on my phone because I don't want to pollute my computer with it, since it's a location for me. The computer and the phone are locations, no matter where they are. I read the news, and what I see is that people have a lot of trouble seeing something as being, as having different moral dimensions. That say someone who was a career criminal who was shot by the police in the commission of a minor crime clearly did not deserve to be wounded by a bullet under law as a penalty. But the consensus seems to be, but since they were unjustly shot, they should not be prosecuted for the crime that they were committing or the crimes they had committed, that all the charges against them should be dropped. And it seems that that sort of, I'm not bringing up any particular case, but more that that's emblematic of the difficulty that people have in putting together a complex case of accountability, in which parties on all sides are both perpetrators and victims, or accountable and helpless in some way. And that the reason for that is that they're not placed within the framework of a sustained narrative. And a sustained narrative is what will unveil the moral complexities of things. And I'm wondering if the orientation philosophy addresses sustained narrative, or if it's implied in the viewpoint of the subjective observer moving continuously through time.
Can you explain what you mean by sustained narrative?
Sure, like let's say one of the Greek classics. We'll say the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid or Dante, something that is very long and complex, that explores the moral dimensions of something from different viewpoints, although it may have a single hero. And that I'm wondering if in orientation philosophy, if that is, if the narrative voice is implied in the single subjective observer viewpoint.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think judging by at least the foundational aspect of orientation being perspectival, it certainly is possible that for an individual with a certain perspective to take a more long view and extended narrative when assessing these things. Certainly we might hope or expect the justice system to do that for us as an institutional sort of program. I think it does take that into an account as a plausibly beneficial course of action, but it makes room for the fact that under different contexts, different individuals, that they might apply a different decision-making heuristic, which would be just as moving and provocative and galvanizing to them as this extended narrative.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Max. Evanique.
Yeah, so I have a question following up to Madeline's question. Does the orientation philosophy take into account what the communicator wants us to see? Like the example that Madeline was describing, you see this a lot today in social media where people will record something on their phones, or people will just put a 30-second blurb online and then everybody makes a judgment about it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, is it also part of orientation philosophy that we see what the communicator wants us to see? If I asked that correctly, I could be.
Yeah, I would say the orientation philosophy addresses what an individual perspective is taking in from that environment. I think it sort of problematizes this aspect of an intention of the person you're communicating with. It really plays in this area of uncertainty when we can't possibly know fully the minds of other people. And so we have to just work with the information that we have. But certainly as an aspect of finding one's way, it will focus on how we use the information that we are exposed to for our personal uses. And it might have something to say about that person who is putting that information out and their intentions, and how that factors into how they're mastering their own situation, the situation of this media environment. I'm not sure it explicitly has something to say about how we're manipulated by unseen intentions. Yeah, that's my initial shot at that, but I'll be thinking about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Great questions, folks, by the way. Next up is Max.
Hello, I actually, it wasn't a question. I wanted to offer an opinion to something that Madeline said, but I think Samantha already stated that as well. Can I do that?
Sure.
So, Madeline, if I understand your question about sustained narrative, I was going to offer the opinion that this philosophy of orientation is probably very, very personal in that context, meaning that in that example of story about the bullet and the crime, if my source of information is only one source of information that always has the same leaning, then that's sustained narrative, really, because it's always leaning that way. But if I am specifically seeking out multiple angles on it, then perhaps there is no sustained narrative, and really I have to take all the different angles and make my own orientation adjustments based on it. I just wanted to offer that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. Next up is Mike. Mike, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm trying it. Thank you. Very perceptive analysis. I'm still trying to understand it.
Mike, we can barely hear you. There is Mike. Mike, you have a Mike, you have a problem with your audio. If you could fix that, and then we'll and just go ahead and type another exclamation mark. Okay. Next, let's take the question that Jeff had asked about Hannah Arendt. Any thoughts about that, Samantha?
Well, I am not a Hannah Arendt expert. I will say that certainly her conception of the banality of evil seems to fit into what I perceive to be this distinction between the ground and the figure, that really the environment of a technology or even an institution can create these an effect of what we might call evil without, with us just maintaining business as usual. I think it's relevant in that way, but I'd be very interested to hear what other people think about making a connection between these things.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we have not studied Hannah Arendt too much in this one, so it's kind of out. I don't think too many people have expertise in that, and it will be difficult to kind of connect that up, and because it's like a whole philosophy. This is another philosophy, and we are applying it to digital. So let's look at the digital. You had a great question. So can you restate your question? This the second one that you had.
On my slide?
Yes. Oh. On your slide, there was a second.
Yes. Let me bring that up here. The second question was, are there more characteristics of a digital era sensibility that affect our orientation?
Wonderful. So what is it that we did not cover? Samantha did, identified several aspects of the digital. And this is a big topic, okay? Because what happens is that you can look at something in the rear view mirror. You can say, what did print do? And then you have a lot of data because you know what it was like before and after. Its effects are already there. We're living through this. So there is a lot that we do not know. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to share what you think, or what are the other aspects of the digital that we need to be aware of. Let's start with Evanik, followed by Madeline. Evanik.
So I think it's one thing that is, I don't think it was, I don't want to say it wasn't covered, but I just think it wasn't maybe thought of is, in a sense, in social media, everybody's a journalist now with the advent of cell phones and technology and the way people can post to social media. And just a famous one was George Floyd, for instance. Like, it can go viral so fast. And I think maybe that's one of the things where we have to look at in terms of like how we get our media or how we get our news, is that everybody has a say, everybody has an input, but not everybody has the journalistic training or investigative reporting. I think that's part of it too. So it just drums up emotions without being able to look fully at the facts.
Wonderful. Excellent point. The number of kind of providers of content have skyrocketed. Instead of having just few people who had the microphone of TV stations and publishing houses, now everybody has that. Excellent. Madeline.
Yes, in terms of what the one salient feature of digital social media is the level of anger that's on there that just did not seem to be around before, at least not in the public sphere, and how quickly people will go to to cursing, to death threats. I find it to be incredibly alarming and dismaying. Excuse me. And in a previous meetup, actually a couple of them, we talked about envy. And that one of the things that social media does with people posting images is that it facilitates comparisons. And when you're comparing yourself to people who are relatively close to you in your social sphere, all the tiny gradations come out, and it brings out a lot of anger. If you compare yourself to someone who is literally eating dirt, you're doing well. If you're comparing yourself to a multi-billionaire, you're doing badly. But most people compare themselves within their general socioeconomic range. And so that brings up so much envy, and the envy generates anger. And I'm wondering if the orientation philosophy, it seems more neutral than this, but I'm wondering if it contains in it somewhere some observations that might lead to an antidote for that level of poisonous anger that comes out on social media.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. Andy, you had a comment about Hannah Arendt. Please go ahead.
No, it's okay. I made it in the chat.
Okay.
It seems you already passed that.
Okay. Next up is Joe.
I think one aspect of social media that we don't necessarily consider is how isolating it can be. We often talk about how it is something that connects so many different people, but it creates, obviously, we all know about echo chambers, but it also can be isolating just in the way that Madeline was talking about, and socially isolating, in that you're continually comparing yourself to other people. That's one. And then that you're also limiting even who you're going to communicate with within that framework. And it leads to a certain degree of loneliness. So I think that it actually can it could actually end up limiting our interactions as well, as much as it can increase the number of interactions that we have. That's in the sense that if you're in this echo chamber and you're in this way of life and the way of thinking, then it becomes an extremely limiting problem. And I think that there's a lot of loneliness as far as people that self-identify as lonely. That number has been increasing. And so there's evidence to suggest that this has not necessarily been something that has always been connecting us. So that's just one comment I would have.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Mike, followed by GPAD. I think it's Jean. Mike, go ahead.
Maybe you can hear me now, hopefully.
Much better. Go ahead.
There's a kind of a behavior change industry that has grown up around this, and the legal structure that we have is oriented toward the robber barons of the 19th century and the Communications Act of 1934, which doesn't really address what's going on with the modern communications media. And we have, what is your thoughts regarding, for example, Cass Sunstein's concept of nudge and Yuval Harari's concept of the algorithmic society that they've been talking about, and what goes on with Cambridge Analytics and some of those other people who've tried to move the entire dialogue into a way that may not be for the benefit of the individuals, or even for the benefit of civilization and society. It sounds like you're addressing this in some form, but I don't quite understand how. So thank you.
Samantha, would you like to respond?
Wow. So yeah, I guess in the discussion that we had, this kind of constitutes the figure versus the ground. We're talking about specifically content, which is affecting our orientations and our decisions of how we are finding our way through this information overload. Perhaps we could say that how these algorithms are working applies some kind of market value dimension of specifically targeting certain people that would be more receptive to certain messages that you're getting out and filtering them through certain information rabbit holes. We can talk within the context of orientation about how these algorithms are affecting our way of mastering our situations in the political sphere or in other spheres based on the kind of information we have access to, and acknowledging that that information is being curated for us and not always, for our benefit. Certainly it has some ulterior motive. The philosophy of orientation, of course, is not in the business of making a judgment about that, although, as much as we might like it to, but observing how it is functioning and how it is working and working over our consciousness. And then perhaps we as individuals can make a judgment about that being an unbeneficial and unwanted interference.
Thank you. Next up is Max.
A short follow-up, if I may.
Oh, very, very short. Go ahead.
Very short. 1984, the Ministry of Truth was in charge of lying, and a similar set of ministries. Do you think that our legal structure, our government structure has a role in trying to, on a more even-handed way than 1984, that there should be some legislation to solve this problem?
Let's go to Max. I mean, I don't want to put Samantha in spot for asking any questions. Here we are just talking. The topic is we're talking about digital, and we're trying to see what trends we have not yet talked about. Max, go ahead.
Okay, and I wanted to go back, and I hope I'm staying on subject.
Yes.
And I'm sorry if I'm not. I wanted to go back and sort of tie in what Joseph and Madeline said.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was amazed also how fast the public taboos sort of went away once public figures started saying out loud certain things, and how fast the taboos that seemed like stood there for decades went away. It's like overnight almost to me. And based on that, I have seen based on what people have said or done in social media, I have seen in my personal experience decades friendships dissipate. Question, Samantha, is that, in your opinion, or maybe there is a thinking on it, is that a signal or a sign of a very weak or suppressed initial orientation, or is it really a process of reorientation happening with some sort of a trigger?
Great question, Max. But Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I would perhaps default back to the perspectival aspects of orientation. I think this might function differently in certain people. And I think it's a good question of what sort of factors on an individual level would generate a weak orientation, as you say, that these friendship ties could be severed on the basis of these, transient political issues. I don't think I myself have put enough thought into what would constitute a weak orientation of certainly one of the things that we talk about in orientation is that the strongest foothold in our orientation is our routines. So it's an interesting question to interrogate. We have routines of social interaction and developing these long-term relationships. And then we have these new routines in the digital social media space of interacting in this way and being angered and galvanized by politics. It is a very interesting question to the extent to which our routine of being online has somehow surpassed these routines of building and developing relationships. And I think that would be a very interesting thing to look into further.
So folks, you have to realize these are all very tough questions. These are all excellent questions. We're talking about what is happening to the society and to psyche in the midst of the biggest technology change that we have seen in our lifetimes. And the implications are going to be very large. They are going to be unknown. And it's more important in any meetup anyway. The questions that you walk away with are more important than the answers that you walk away with. And in this meetup, it is particularly true. I want to address the question without addressing the digital because because it is very difficult. But you can see the parallels in the past technology transitions. Look at the difference between before TV and after TV. What happens to standards of people? Before TV, the group that you're actually living with, your family, your coworkers, your community, is the milieu from which you derive values, interact with, set expectations, enforce expectations, all of that process. That is the context within which you are operating. TV, and people consume so much of it, okay? That is disembodied. These are not your friends. These are not your family. They are very different. And the purpose of those TV shows is to get you hooked onto it. So they are not even real. They are products of imagination of somebody else for purposes very different than actual living. And they occupy such a large place in your consciousness, in your psyche. So the way in which you think of values gets warped. And that is in the past. So you can see it in the past. Now, just imagine of what digital is. Digital is like digital on one hand, it's basically all these medias on steroids. So it's like TV on steroids. It can also be print on steroids, but that's your choice. But if you're, so what I'm saying is that that gives you some direction in which things can happen. So that's all I can think of. Let's see, there were some amazing questions here on this topic. So one was by Paul. So Paul, could you restate your question about the thrownness? Is Paul there?
Yeah, Paul is here. I just had to open everything.
Wonderful. Go ahead. Go ahead and restate the question.
Samantha, first thing, you are amazing. Like you, now I have to study again. Honestly, you are amazing. Okay, that throwness was when I heard you about Stegmeier and Heidegger. Let's put it together. And then I realized, and especially when you said that those two communicate together, that's what it is. I don't know, with your young age, how come I'm old and stupid in that case? Because how come you understand that connection, and I knew both of them, and I never put that connection together. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Like how smart you are. Honestly, I don't agree with your political opinions. That's we can disagree, but that's not the point. The point is that to understand that we are all thrown out in the world, in the beings, and in the social interactions. We are not part of it. Even that everybody will say that Zuckerberg and Jack, whatever it's from Twitter, that they organize that. No, they don't organize that. It is automatically the world around. That's what Nietzsche started. Then Heidegger took it over. It's what is around us, and we are in it. We are in it. We are thrown in it. That's the difference between Nietzsche, Heidegger, and many people that after them. We are thrown in it. It's not materialist, idealist. There is world around that. Something like what probably Shrikant can explain to you much better than me, what Hinduism is about. That's what I feel about that. That there is we don't have control about it. Please understand, we don't have control about it. Governments are trying to control it, but they won't control it. The system is controlling itself somehow. Like the best economy in the world is Adam Smith's economy, that it controls itself. Like that's we should start trying to understand that. I don't think that in my lifetime, definitely not. We will understand it. But I am admiring, Samantha, what you said, to put those two together, and now it clicked. Now it clicked. Do you remember whatever you read about Heidegger, about his aim at technology? You know, since 1940s and 39, 40s, 43, 44, he had that big speech when he was talking about now technology to have better planes or anything like that. Was this what he was talking about? Our technology taking our minds. That's what he was talking about. No technology that we have better cars or anything like that. That's what he was talking about. And that's why he was way ahead of everybody else. Please don't think that I am. I know about all his fascist problems and all that stuff. I know that, but that's and you connected that for me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for your comment and your compliments. Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly that thrownness is very resonant and very relevant in the philosophy of orientation. I think that is pretty much the basis of what gives rise to this unsettlement, and the primary distinction between unsettlement and reassuring calmness. I think they're coming from the same basis, and you point that out nicely.
Wonderful, thank you. And after looking at the questions on digital, I think Jeff has lots of things to say about Hannah. So we will go ahead and, Hannah Arendt. So we'll go ahead and deal with that as soon as we're done with this section on digital. Next question on digital was from Mike. Mike had an interesting question. Mike, go ahead.
Which one, Shrikant, me?
Yes.
Yeah.
You had a question about, sorry.
Right, yeah, my question was, is there a fundamental difference examining these phenomena? Somebody my age, I'm in my late 50s, I've spent the first 32 years of my life without any technology at all. And then henceforth, I've had and involved making part of my living through technology, as opposed to somebody who, say, is 20, who has spent their entire life with technology. Is there some difference between that person who's had it from day one, as opposed to somebody my age who's never had it, been introduced to it, and is now using it a great deal?
Wonderful. And I want to open this question up for everybody. And I want to put one more data point. You have to look at a 5-year-old, okay, and how they use their phone. Okay, they put 20-year-olds to shame. Okay, so there is the issue of familiarity with the medium, whether that's a medium. So for example, I grew up without TV. So the way I interact with TV is very different than most other people who grew up with TV. So if you grow up with the iPhone and the internet in your hand, you interact with it differently than if you, folks, any observations about how different people of different generation are using the internet, and what differences do you see in their sensibility? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to comment. Let's start with Samantha. Samantha, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'd say the first thing that comes to mind for me is that an older person will probably have spent more time developing their routines, which again are the strongest footholds we have in orienting our lives, our paths, our priorities. And so this helps a great deal when we are, say, evaluating face-to-face communication and relationship building routines as being more beneficial than, say, online life and that kind of socialization. That perhaps is the most sort of salient point from the perspective of orientation. But I would say that in as much as enough people are engaging and avidly in these technologies of any age, and to the extent to which they're developing these patterns and routines of intense online engagement, we're all living in the society that is created by that activity. And in particular, with respect to disruptive politics, we're all affected by government shutdowns, for instance, and those kinds of things. So that would be an important distinction, I think.
Thank you. Next up is going to be G-Pad, followed by Joe.
Hi, yeah, this is Jean. I'm actually driving. It's so fascinating. I have to chime in. So about this technology, actually, I have I have two sons, 13 and 16. So what I found the advantage of today's technology is they can figure out anything. You don't need to teach them how to cook anything. If they want to do it, they can find the recipe anywhere and they can do it, which I found is amazing. You know, they can learn anything they want to learn. You don't have to teach them, how to cook. They can figure out the best way to cook ramen soup, like my older son, and the most authentic way to cook it. And I don't even know. But on the other hand, they seem to lack interest of the physical world. I try to take them to traveling, to Glacier Park, to all this, and they're just not interested. And I think that's, we talk about the social media too, like people are three-dimensional. I think they're mentally more developed, but their relationship with the physical world seems lack that connection. I saw a friend of mine mention how his teenager girl sits next to the boyfriend and they text each other. This is crazy. It's just like unbelievable. So it's like, I think there's something is missing. I think the way to solve it is that, like, we have to work with the new technology and intertwine with the physical interaction. Like, I think the internet is amazing. That's why I can join this conversation. If I have the meeting with all the neighborhood every day, like routine gather, I can never get in this in depth because people that may not be interested. But on the other hand, it'll be even more fascinating if we all can sit in the same room. You know, it's much different level of communication. I think maybe the way is how we can take advantage of both, you know, both the in-person and the internet. I think that's maybe the way to reach next level.
Thank you, Jean. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Katie. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the experience with the physical world has a way of actually impacting our memories. And I think that that's essentially how one of the distinctions between people that are now growing up with technology versus ones that haven't. I'll give a very simple example. Tell me tell me the people's phone number that you're going to be calling a little bit later today. And I could tell you everybody in high school. I could tell you all my friends' phone numbers. I can't tell you the phone number of anybody anymore. And that's primarily because you just hit a name and you hit a button. Same thing with a map. You know, the way you're developing your interaction with the physical world. Where am I driving to? Well, I'll just, you know, hit a few buttons and then you have some orientation as to where you're going. You have an understanding and you can pick up things and routines over time, but it's not like actually going through using a physical map and driving and actually developing that part of the brain. And I think that while I haven't read a lot of studies in this area, I have to believe that it's impacting our minds and our memories in ways that we really don't know, because if you think about how the plasticity of the brain actually works and how it's done with actually, there are mental exercises that you do in order to improve your memory or to actually improve the way you even rationalize certain things. That is no longer being done. The computer's doing it for you. So that there's this, there's something that's being lost in there, and I really can't, while I can't articulate it, I do think our memories overall are actually impacted in one way or another.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Katie, followed by Jonathan. Katie.
Jane's comment reminded me of, she's saying, you know, everybody can find a recipe online. That kind of sparked my interest. And also Evanik had said, like, everyone can be a journalist. I think a lot of like professions were really changed when a lot of things went online too. Like, I was a library science major, and being a librarian back in the day was like really a powerful job because you had access to everything. And now with online everything, it's like everyone's kind of an expert, and it really cuts into their expertise a little bit if you can just go online and do it.
Yeah, Katie, that's a great observation. I also would look at the flip side, that, you know, having so many librarians around, billions of them, the actual value delivered from that function of being able to find things in a very fluid way. I mean, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Bob, you had an interesting observation. Do you want to make it Bob, Dave, and John? Bob, would you like to make that observation? Because what happens is that many people don't read the chat. So if you want to say something, you're welcome.
I don't have much to say, but if you have a question, I'll answer it.
That's fine. That's fine. It was a good comment in the chat.
Thank you.
Next up is going to be John. John, go ahead.
One of the things I've noticed about the pre-internet and internet age with regard to truth and determining what's true is that in the pre-internet age, it may not necessarily be clear what's true, but the options for what is true are sort of filtered through news media, and that can go good or bad. You know, there's plenty of examples in history news media becoming propaganda and whatnot. But in the internet age, it seems that it's not so much what's true that is disturbing, it's what's possible to be true that makes having a constructive dialogue about what is true nearly impossible. Because if you are in a conversation with people or a group of people, and it's, you know, any sort of issue, that person can, or either consciously or unconsciously, either make the issue so obscure such that it's impossible to reach any solid footing. And I just wondered what you had to say about that.
Go ahead, Samantha.
Yes. Yeah, that is a very unsettling phenomenon. I would say this might be related tangentially to your comment, but one thing that your comment incites in me is this idea that when we're talking about individual people, although we might think we are privileging true information versus false information, ultimately the distinction is still this unsettlement versus reassuring calmness. And so it's interesting the extent to which, when exposed to a wide variety of disagreeing information from unreliable sources, the kind of information that will be reassuring for different people and for what reasons. I can imagine that some people, that heuristic is, do I have an authoritative source on this? Or is this a journalist with some credibility? Can I tell that they've done some research of all sides? And that might be how you relate to certain information that you find online, and to generate that sense of reassuring calmness. For another individual, it might be, oh, does this particular view I'm being exposed to calm me because it reassures me that my own biases or my my bigoted notions are in fact correct because they're being reflected in this online source. And we all find that that reassuring calmness in different ways by different heuristics. And so it's important that we acknowledge that, and that hopefully more people can transition into a more nuanced look at what information and the caliber of the information they're responding to online.
Wonderful, thank you. So next, we'll take the next batch of questions that's going to be about the disruptive politics. There's a really interesting observation of Samantha of saying that actually on both sides of the aisle, you know, with across the political spectrum and across countries, there is this disruptive politics that is far more than it has been in the past. So why is that? What are your thoughts about that? So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to comment on that. Going to give 10 seconds and then, okay, Jeff.
Yeah, I gotta try not to drag this into our own territory. This is very much her territory.
You know what? Let's do one thing, Jeff. You've said lots of interesting things about Arendt. So please tell us a little bit about Arendt and how her approach relates to the philosophy of orientation.
Oh, great. Okay, great. That is what I was going to eventually do anyway. But first, I just wanted to say I've always appreciated how willing you are to experiment with the format. And I think today you've hit on something that it's definitely appropriate, at least for you know, the harder, deeper, newer topic.
Yeah, what I try to do, Jeff, is that you know, the medium has to match what we are trying to do.
Of course.
So depending on the complexity, depending on the familiarity of the audience with the material, I keep on changing the format to meet it. But appreciate the compliment. Go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, yeah. So you really don't need to read a big book by Hannah Arendt, and it's you have to devote a few months to it because you have to read it a little bit at a time. the appearance is really pretty simple. It comes, I mean, it's, for those of you who've done the Peterson meetups, I think you know the problem of relativism or the threat of relativism. But for art, she takes a more positive view of that, or more. Some of her writings, people get the feeling that she wants to go back to the past, but it's really quite clear that she doesn't think we could, even if we wanted to. She doesn't even entertain whether we want to go back to the past where, you know, we knew about God and kings and so forth. So it's really the appearances, everything is appearance. That's basically Kant, right? Or Nietzsche, really, same thing in that regard, which is that all we have is what we see. And so, oh, well, now everything's becomes subjective, you know, it's all your own thing. So how do we work with that? So that sounds very much like what Stegmeier is doing. But there's a really, and then the second major point about that is basically that you have two senses of the word appearance, which I think only really happens in art. One is the one I just gave, which is that, well, I see it, but I don't know if it's real, right? I don't know about truth from that. And then, of course, the Greeks ran far with that. The other one is this political sense, which is to say that you have to appear in order to influence people, right? You have to make an appearance at a meetup to have your opinion done. It's not enough just to think to yourself. That doesn't do anything. You have to go out into the world. And so the world is basically a world of appearances, but it is, some appearances last longer than others, let's put it that way, right? So there's like they become sturdy, and then if other people see the same things that you see, well, then we call that reality or the world, and it's always shared. It's done to people. So there again, you have the politics. It's like you have to go out into the world, and then you have to make your change. And so a lot of people, that's sort of a difficult thing for her, because she's always calling us up to do stuff. And then you get your Peterson here again, which is you have your myths, so forth. It's about famous people that rose up out of nothing, out of the ground, to become a figure that would lead the people to something new, right? He didn't necessarily have the I'm going to say he, because the hero is usually he, but they don't have to know where they're going. They just have to be somebody that you can make out against the background of the crowd. You know, I was just thinking that the guy with the horns on the January 6th. You know, he's a figure, right? That's sort of what it looks like. And so then to wrap this up, that basically I think what's cool that she doesn't talk about. Oh, I was just going to say that basically, I've been studying a lot of art, and so I've been hearing people talk about it, and they have a lot of problem with this idea that you have to stand out to get anything done. And I think it's somewhat a generational thing. I think it's like nowadays everybody wants to be social, right? They want to just be with the crowd, and so they don't want to stand out and do this thing. And of course, you know, then you have the hero's journey, which are the opposite. That people don't necessarily want to do that. Well, now I'm seeing the connection to McLuhan, because this idea of standing out. I mean, he does. I don't know. I haven't read enough of him to know whether he really treats the idea of people standing out. It's more about things. But then, you know, we perceive people. So now I'm motivated to go back and read more McLuhan to figure out what he says about figure-ground distinction, because I think that's something that art doesn't get into. And maybe it explains somewhat her lack of appeal, although she's getting a lot of attention because of the current political situation. But people run aground on this phenomenology part.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate that. So let me repeat the question. The question for the next question is, why is it that there is so much more disruptive politics in the digital age with the internet? Let's start with Joe.
I think because the barrier of entry is lower. Essentially, as we all become the ability to tell our own stories, I think that there's before, if you think about it, if you go back to times of where the political ads were relegated to something to TV, or even our opinions were relegated to something, a very small group of people had access to that medium. Now everybody does. And so you can start a movement very quickly. And there's a lot of disruption that can come out of that, because that's where you're having a lot of misinformation in this. So if somebody's unsettled about topic A versus, and somebody just happens to speak about topic B, then they may make a connection that is not necessarily true. And they would actually galvanize together, and they can convince each other. But again, the barrier of entry is significantly lowered by the fact that everybody now has a voice. And I feel like we're almost back to a point of like kind of an oral culture, who can tell the best story, and then convince the most people. And that's not necessarily always going to be true. Like, so I think that and that leads to a lot of this, I think it can also lead to echo chambers as well, too. But that's a whole nother side of things.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be John, Dave, and Mike.
Yeah, I think that the dynamics of the internet make feedback loops more possible, such that information can amplify itself. Whereas before the internet, you had a news organization that would sort of tell stories, and then you sitting at home would maybe watch that story or read that story. And then you'd have to go out into the world to talk about that. And for that, for that message to get amplified, a mob of people would need to get together and start, raising pitchforks. But now the feedback loops happen online. The pitchforks can happen online. And you have these situations where people have created alternate realities. And those realities exist, and I feel like they actually have their own life. They don't really meet the physical world all that often until you see things like January 6th, where those virtual realities, suddenly come into contact with the physical reality, and you have this guy wearing horns. So I feel like it has to do with the way information is disseminated, and the way that, much like a guitar amp, you can sort of get feedback loops.
Excellent point, John. Thank you. Next up is Dave.
I also think one of the reasons things have become more discordant is because we've become desensitized. And so I'm also thinking of increasing violence on TV and in movies. The goal of the media is not to inform, it's to grab your attention so that they can market to you. And so they're needing more and more to make an impact. And so that's why things are getting more and more violent. That's why I think things are getting more and more discordant, because it takes a larger magnitude to get people to focus on something that they normally wouldn't be focused on.
That's a great point, Dave. Fantastic point, because what happens is that like the normal human context and feedback and corrective mechanisms, all of those are pushed down, and those are all gone. And you have this, uncontext, uncontext interaction. Next up is Mike.
Yeah, that is a perfect response, especially what I was going to say. I think disruptive politics in general they sell. And when we were talking earlier about the dopamine fix that we get through social media contact or playing a game online, I think you can also get it through confirmation bias, which I think is as highly addictive as playing an internet game. A good example of that is if you watch a political speech, and if you have your favorite news source, or if you happen to be on one side of the aisle to the other, you can watch the same speech and then watch the responses from the respective parties on the news cable. And you will swear that two different speeches just took place. I think sometimes that's put in place on purpose because they know it is going to sell. If the responses are based on a certain slant or angle, creating a disruptive politic, I think your viewers will tend to watch your response. And the same thing is taking place on the other side of the aisle while it's the same speech in the middle.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Jeff, followed by Bob. Jeff.
On the disruptive politics, I think the simpler explanation is that people have always been discontent. It's just that now they have the means to express themselves. And I always push back against, like, sort of, the media is doing this to us. The media does whatever we want it to do to us. That's sort of the brilliance, if you will, of the free market. That basically it gives whatever voice there is, then we get that. So that basically it was being suppressed before. And you say, well, it didn't feel like that. Of course, we don't know what it felt like 100 years ago, except by reading stuff. But if you don't think you have a chance of expressing, then you're going to suppress it, at a much lower level, right? You said, so you should stop being aware of it if you can't do anything about it. But now, for the last 50 years, we've been pummeled with, well, not with the message. We've had the experience. We could see that we can be heard and do things, and so now suddenly these thoughts are given voice. So I think it's not to say that it's good, but I don't think it isn't bad either. It's just we're seeing I think we're seeing more of the way things really are. If there's to say really is kind of a danger.
Thank you, Jeff. I mean, I think it's a great point. The point that actually the technology just makes it just gives you more ability to do things that you want to do. So there is a core nature that you have, and then this just enhances your ability to do that. So I think that's a great point. Next up is going to be Bob, followed by Kate. Bob.
I'd like to offer an explanation for discordancy. In the modern media, anyone can talk, and that means there's a great number of people, and anyone can listen, and there is also a great number of people. So just statistically, you're bound to have opposing views out there somewhere, and the opposing views are likely to speak up. This is not true if you're talking one-on-one, because there's if you're talking one-on-one, you can interact and adjust your differences and listen to each other. End of statement.
Excellent point, Bob. So there is a much more likelihood of developing echo chambers as a result of that. Next up is going to be Kate.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Jeff was saying, and I think to some extent I really agree with him. I think it's probably something innate in us that the media is just kind of hooking onto as a way to loop us in and get us addicted. I mean, it's not just the media. Like, there's a reason why reality shows with lots of conflict are really popular. I personally don't watch them, but I mean, I think there's something innate in people where we are drawn to conflict.
Excellent point. I like the idea that Marshall McLuhan has of media ecology. And I think everybody should look at the media ecology that they are plugged into. If TV is causing you problems, don't watch it. It's a very powerful, it seems like a simple thing to say, but it's very powerful. It's actually true. So you have to be conscious of what each of the media is doing to you and doing for you, and you have to choose the proportion of it and purpose for which you're going to use it, because if you don't, then you're going to be a recipient of something somebody else is doing. If you don't make the choices of that, and if you just plug in to something and just kind of react to it, then you have given up your agency. So Samantha, what do you think about this, the growth of disruptive politics in this time?
Well, Shrikant, I think it's grown. I think we do see more strategizing at this macro level. And I think some of the critiques of movements like the Occupy movement or Arab Spring was that they had very good strategies when it came to how to effectively disrupt business as usual. But when it came down to developing constructive ideas and new institutions surrounding their ideas and alternative government and structures of leadership, perhaps they were not quite as well equipped. And I think that's what I am principally interested in, at least as an individual.
Okay, let's put that as a question. Last question, folks. How can you do things constructive? We've been talking about the negative consequences. What can you do constructively with media at, political, social level? Any thoughts? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Joe.
All right. Well, I mean, so I want to comment on something that Samantha said that was just triggered something, and something that I was thinking is that there is a pause that comes with these other types of movements that are not digital. Like there has to, there's a lot of things that were going wrong with the Arab Spring. There were prices of food that went up. There were other issues. There were systemic issues that resulted in the Arab Spring. But what happens is it spurs people into action immediately by having social media. That may be one or two things that spurs people, and it's not as well thought out or well planned, and that doesn't lead to doesn't lead to sustainable change. That's something that where the media doesn't, you may be able to get your message out faster, but faster may not necessarily be better in that particular instance. But as far as a productive force, I mean, I think that there are, again, a lot of people have access to getting their voice or message out there that never had it before. And I think that the ability to organize itself, to organize is much more, it's much easier than it's ever been before. I think that it's, I think there are a lot of advantages that you can use as far as raising, funds as well, things like that, that are, that necessarily weren't necessarily available to people before, that were only available on a local level. So, I mean, there are a lot of advantages, but it's interesting. I don't know if it makes for sustainable change. That's one aspect of it. I appreciate Samantha's comment.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Jeff. Jeff, go ahead. And Samantha, you'll get a chance to comment on this later, but I want to get all the comments in and then hand it over to you, Jeff.
So thanks, Samantha, for such a wonderful and rich presentation and discussion. There are a lot of questions that came to me during this time, but I think this last one is in some ways at the heart of the matter with regard to certain major parts of what we're talking about. And I think Shrikant, one of my answers to that question as to why all of the increased opportunities for active disagreement, certainly for the expression of it in all these different ways online. Andy Warhol was only right about his 15 minutes. He couldn't even finish the sentence that everybody would be famous for 15 minutes every day. And that I think we have very little experience as human beings, and we have very little situations that we have seen modeled for us of what I call productive disagreement, where in a way, Samantha, folks can kind of observe what somebody else is saying dispassionately and seek to understand it before they're allowed to actually get oriented about it in terms of deciding what they'd like to agree with, what they'd like to disagree with, how, and what they might want to get from it. if there was a requirement first that you had to ask a few questions regarding, could you tell me a little bit more about that? And if we sort of enforced on ourselves that it was very, very important and maybe necessary for us to be able to entertain somebody else's conclusions and perceptions regarding the perspectives that they have from their vantage point, which includes their entire lived experience as a human being and where they are at that moment. Then, when we then responded, the other person or people had the same job before they engaged with us, that there's a great deal of power in that pause. And we might find out not only kind of how our conclusions are different, but how we reach them and what we could learn from each other from gaining the benefit of these different perspectives from these different vantage points, what Shrikant calls different contexts. If that was the norm, 500% more than it is today, I think that the quality of the results that we might achieve and our satisfaction with those conversations and interactions and the progress that we might be able to make together and the extent to where at least we would recognize the areas where we do agree. And even if we just say, okay, for these other things we disagree and that's the way it is for now, let's see how we might be able to move forward together. I think the tenor and our satisfaction about it, our feeling about it, our connection to each other, and possibly our ability to solve much larger problems based upon that base might be greater. That's my own personal theory about it.
Jeff, that was fantastic. I just simply love it. And actually, Jeff, I don't know whether you were here or not, but I want to let everybody know, this is an ad. On Monday, I'm going to try out this Monday at 12 o'clock, a new format, which is going to be a talk show format. It's going to be like talk show where, we're going to be, the topic is going to be the regular series that we are doing. What did you learn from either Tao Te Ching, Nietzsche meetups, or the Jordan Peterson Bible meetups, Flow meetups, or Ascent of Man? You can pick anything, and it will be long form, where I will actually talk to you. You tell me what you got from it. I will engage you. I'll go back and forth, try to understand your context, not just for me, but try to make it apparent to anybody else who is listening, and do that for several people. I started doing that yesterday, and I thought it was a great idea with my friend Zach, and I thought it was a great idea. And I want to try it out to see, because if you look at it, we're talking about constructive things being done with digital. I think in this meetup, what we have managed to do of the kind of conversations we have had through COVID, the depth at which we have been able to explore them, the extent to which respectfully we've been able to disagree and learn from each other, I think it is truly special. And it's not good enough. There are 10 billion, there are going to be 10 billion people in 2050, and we are reaching very small percentage of them, so it's not good. But I think we are onto something, and I want to build that further and see what we ourselves can do, because ultimately it is all about taking responsibility ourselves. You can't simply blame other people. We ourselves, each of us, has to say, what do I think is the right thing to do, and how do I figure out how to do it, and do what we can in the direction. So Jeff, thank you very much. And I hope you can make it on Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, go ahead. So the question is, how can we use this constructively?
Well, I agree with Jeff Gee in the concept that we've always had this same problem. It's just that now there's a quickening, there's an amplification, and there's a number of parties that can put their thumb on the scale and alternate it. And the French Revolution, in fact, the Russian Revolution, the Magna Carta Revolution, all occur faster and with greater intensity than they occurred back then. But it's the same kind of thing that occurred that our founding fathers and Hamlet had in Shakespeare. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Samantha.
Yes. Well, I'm so thankful for the comments that preceded me. I would just add, I think what is lacking if we want to improve this situation, create more constructive political agendas and political action, perhaps a certain level of expertise, and to go back to routines again. I think what needs to be reinfused into our political thoughts and agendas is the context, is the very real my community context of what is specifically going on at this current situation, this new situation in which I find myself. There are specific people, a specific leadership structure involved of the people that are interested in making a change. They have specific temperaments, they have specific levels of experience, they have specific time availability and willingness to involve themselves in public affairs. I think it takes a certain amount of expertise to, one, have a nuanced enough understanding of the context of a political issue in order to change it, and a nuanced understanding of the community and the people that want to help you make that change. And for the people that want to be a part of these movements and not necessarily in the leadership, I think it's important to construct these routines of, yes, I'm a person that cares about public affairs, and therefore I know to go to these certain spaces. Maybe they're face-to-face, or maybe they're online, to meet with people who are organizing political actions that are attentive to the very specific and temporal needs of my community and the people in it, and that can organize us all together in gainful action. I think that's important. I recently read Angela Duckworth's book about grit, and she suggests to all parents out there that, and to anyone in particular, but so that parents structure for their children the expectation that they undertake one hard thing, and that this one hard thing is something that requires deliberate practice. And specifically in psychology, deliberate practice is where your current level of skill is not quite up to the task of the challenge that's before you. Certainly challenges in political affairs almost always meet that standard. And that you commit yourself to working on this one hard thing on a regular basis before you switch to something else. You commit for at least a period of 2 years. She says this builds the psychological characteristic of grit in human beings, and much more than talent or any other factor, this is what makes for successful, self-actualized people. So I think within the philosophy of orientation, this speaks a lot to the power of habits as footholds in finding our way and mastering the situation. So that's what I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samantha. And on that note, I want to make the connection to tomorrow's meetup. Tomorrow's meetup is going to be about authentic courage. How do you overcome roadblocks? How do you transform your habits and your routines to get to a better place? So that's what it's going to be about. And on Monday, we're going to have that meetup on talk show format. So don't miss that. Samantha, this was wonderful. I thought you did a fantastic job of laying things down on the table. By its nature, this topic is such that the primary value we can create is to lay down questions for everybody so that we can all start working on them together. And you did a fantastic job of that. So thank you very much. And I'm going to close the meetup now.